So the 2000s, in my opinion, is one of the greatest eras of all time, and you can make the argument it is the best era of all time. And if you remember, a couple of months ago I made a video titled The Most Forgotten Stars of the 2000s. This time I'm going to do something a little different but similar, and I'm going to talk about the most forgotten teams of the 2000s. Because in an era where you have the big three Spurs, the 2000s Pistons, and obviously Shaq and Kobe, it's going to be a lot of teams that people usually tend to forget. And in today's video we're going to talk about a couple of those teams and give them some recognition that they probably deserve. But before we get started with this video, it's going to be pretty long, so let me get the plugs out the way. If you're not subscribed, what are you doing? Hit that subscribe button and press that bell for post notifications. And if you want to show your support to this video, do not forget to drop a like. But without further ado, let's get things started and start with the first team, and that is the 2000s Utah Jazz. Now when it comes to forgotten teams in NBA history, not just the 2000s, I think the Jazz are right at the top of that list. I mean, we're talking about a team led by head coach Jerry Sloan, who essentially made the pick and roll famous, which is just iconic in its own right. And the guys that he used to continue that pick and roll legacy were Deron Williams and Carlos Boozer. Yes, before Deron Williams was knocking out Frank Gore in boxing matches, he was an NBA player, as during his time in Utah he was a consistent 19 to 20 point per game scorer along with 10 assists, while also being one of the more efficient shooters in the league. You just had to be there to see what this man was able to do with the basketball. He had it on a string, handles of a god for real. Then you throw in Carlos Boozer, who was a great roll man, was nice on the boards, he could also bang down low in the post, he could do everything you wanted from a big in that system. And they were surrounded by really solid pieces, I would say. You had defenders like Paul Millsap, Wesley Matthews could space the floor as well while defending, but the big piece that was next to them was AK-47 himself, Andre Kirilenko. I don't know how many of you guys remember, but when I made my forgotten players of the 2000s, Andre Kirilenko was on that list. I mean, we're talking about one of the greatest defenders of all time at his peak, with the ability to defend essentially all 5 positions, the length and size to be able to guard bigs, and the lateral quickness to be able to guard perimeter players. And this guy was also a shot blocking machine. The guy really had everything you wanted in a defender. And when we talk about players ahead of their time, a guy like AK-47 fits the bill. This guy was so far ahead of his time with his switchability and versatility on the defensive side of the ball. And with that collection of talent, the Utah Jazz were around a 50-win team essentially every single season, and in the Western Conference with how stacked it was, that's pretty impressive. Unfortunately though, for 3 consecutive seasons from the 2008 to 2010 NBA season, they would run into the Los Angeles Lakers led by Kobe Bryant and inevitably lose. And after a report of an alleged disagreement between Deron Williams and the head coach Jerry Sloan resigned mid-season on February 7, 2011, and later that same month on February 23rd, Deron Williams was traded to the New Jersey Nets. But while we're on the topic of the Western Conference in the 2000s, that brings us to our next team, and that's the Rockets. I gotta say, the Rockets in the 2000s were one of the more interesting teams in the NBA, as it all started in the draft of 2002 where they took Yao Ming with the first overall pick. And after a couple of seasons where the Rockets identified him as the franchise player, they decided to build around him accordingly. They brought in 3-and-D players such as Shane Battier and Ron Artest, who were far ahead of their time in terms of value to an NBA roster. They brought in quality role players such as Aaron Brooks to score off the bench, and also Rafer Alston. But the biggest piece that they surrounded Yao Ming with obviously was his crime partner, and that was Tracy McGrady. Now though McGrady was no longer at his peak in Orlando, primarily due to injuries at that point in his career, he was still regarded as one of the better wings in the NBA, and some people still were comparing him to Kobe Bryant. So it just goes to show how good of a player Tracy McGrady was even at that point in his career. And obviously the gamble to pair both of them together with the injury history that both of them had, it paid off, as the Rockets would have multiple 50+ win seasons and would make the playoffs rather consistently. And I believe the highlight of their time together was the 2008 NBA season, as they won 55 games, finished with the 4th best record in the Western Conference, having a top 10 defense in the league, and they did that while Yao Ming only played 55 games and Tracy McGrady playing only 62. So that year alone truly showed the depth that this roster had, along with the consistency that head coach Rick Adelman was able to provide to this organization. Now some of you guys may be wondering, man, what really happened? What went wrong in that situation if they were even able to win games without their 2 best players being on the court consistently? And my answer is that a lot of things went wrong. Honestly, I think the biggest thing is injuries, but another thing is poor play from Tracy McGrady. I don't think I have to get into too much depth because a lot of YouTubers have talked about Tracy McGrady's failures in the postseason, but to put into perspective how big of a failure Tracy McGrady was in Houston as far as the postseason is concerned, concerned, just look at the 2009 NBA season. They never were able to make it out of the first round until that year, and ironically, Tracy McGrady didn't even play in that postseason. But speaking of players playing, that brings us to Ray Allen's 2000s Milwaukee Bucks. Now, if I'm being honest, I really just wanted to include this team because of one particular year, and that is the 2001 NBA season. Because if you look at the other years of Milwaukee in the 2000s, like 03, 2002, 2000, it really isn't much to talk about. They were a sub 500 team that was barely making the playoffs. But the 2001 Milwaukee Bucks, I have to say, is one of the more underrated teams of all time. They finished with 52 wins and were one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference, finishing second in the East. And though they were a bottom 10 defense in the NBA, they were still one of the best offenses in the league, finishing first in offensive rating and second in points per game. They had two All-Stars on the roster that led them to 52 wins, as one of them was Glenn Robinson, who averaged 22 points, 7 rebounds, and 3 assists, shooting 47% from the field and 82% at the free throw line. But the main star on the team was their other All-Star and All-NBA player in Ray Allen, who averaged 22 points a game also, along with 5 rebounds and 5 assists, 2 steals, shooting 48% from the field, 43% from 3 on 6 attempts, and 89% from the field, which accumulates to a true shooting percentage of 61%. And also shout out to Sam Cassell. I think he's one of the more underrated players of his time, a very good playmaker, and also was able to take advantage of the spacing in order to get the ball to the right spots of the stars. And with a team like this, they were able to get to the Eastern Conference Finals and lose to the Philadelphia 76ers, led by the MVP and Allen Iverson, in a 7-game series. Now, I will admit there is a lot of controversy surrounding this series, as some people say it was rigged. I think even Ray Allen came out and said that, but I'm not really going to give my opinion on that, because at the end of the day, it is what it is. Not going to spend time addressing a rumor that has no real concrete facts to it. But while we're on the topic of teams getting screwed over, that brings us to the 2000 Sacramento Kings. Now, the greatest era of Sacramento Kings basketball was easily in the 2000s, because when we talk about criminally underrated and slept on teams, the Sacramento Kings of the 2000s, led by Chris Webber, Mike Bibby, Peja Stojakovic, they fit that bill perfectly. I mean, we're talking about a team that was able to win around 55 games each season while consistently being one of the top 5 to 10 offenses in the league. You got players like Mike Bibby, who was one of the better and underrated point guards of his time with the ability to space the floor. You have Vlade Divac in the paint, who's also one of the more solid players of his generation, a decent rebounder and shot blocker, while also being a really underrated passer out of the post with their high basketball IQ. And then you get to guys like Peja Stojakovic and Chris Webber, and man, I've made videos talking about both of those guys, and I firmly believe that they are some of the most underrated players of all time. Webber is one of the more underrated bigs that just finally got into the Hall of Fame. Can you believe that? And in the case of Peja Stojakovic, many people forget he actually finished top 5 in MVP voting before in his career. I mean, we're talking about one of the most skilled offensive players of all time at his peak. Those two were easily one of the more underrated, and I mean criminally underrated, duos ever. And it all built to the 2002 NBA season, where they finished winning 61 games. They were 6th in defensive rating, 3rd in offensive rating, and 2nd in points per game. And we're on the verge of stopping a Shaq and Kobe three-peat, being up 3-2 on the Los Angeles Lakers in the 2002 Western Conference Finals. And had it not been for some questionable calls that many people say was rigged, but like I said earlier, I'm not going to even address stuff like that in this video, there's a good chance that they would have won the NBA championship against the New Jersey Nets coming out of the Eastern Conference. But unfortunately, that didn't happen and they lost, and obviously the Kings would eventually split up due to injuries and old age, or whatever you want to attribute it to, and the Kings fell back into the misery of being a horrible organization all over again. But speaking of organizations that are horrible and I despise, that brings us to the Indiana Pacers. Now, when you talk about mid teams, the Indiana Pacers, my goodness, they are so mid. I mean, we're talking about a team that just lives to be competitive, and that's it. But I don't want to shit on them too much, because when we're talking about a team in this video, we're talking about forgotten teams, and this team in the 2000s of the Pacers is pretty forgotten. I mean, you have players like Al Harrington and also Reggie Miller. At the ending of his career, he was able to give them a spark, especially sometimes in the playoffs with some clutch performances. Then you throw in Ron Artest, who's one of the best defenders of all time at his peak, and in the 2004 season actually averaged 18 points, 5 rebounds, and 4 assists, shooting 42% from the field and 73% at the free throw line, which would lead to him making his first and only All-Star appearance. But the man that they were led by in the 2000s primarily was Jermaine Jermaine O'Neal, who even finished top 5 in MVP voting in the 2004 season when he led them to 61 wins. But throughout his prime, he was one of the better post scorers in the league, averaging 19 points and 10 rebounds on 46% shooting from the field, as well as 72% at the free throw line. And as I said earlier, in the 2004 season, he was considered an MVP candidate, finishing top 5 in the voting. I mean, I have to say, in 2004, they were a legit contender to get to the NBA Finals, losing to the Detroit Pistons in 6 games. I mean, think about it. They were literally just a couple of games away of getting to the NBA Finals, losing in the conference finals, and they actually put up a better fight against the Detroit Pistons, who went on to win the championship, defeating Shaq and Kobe's Lakers. And had it not been for a poor shooting performance in Game 6, they could have took it to a Game 7, as no team scored 70 points in the closeout game, as it was a 65-69 game. So had certain things bounced their way at the end of that series, they probably could have gone to the NBA Finals. And then we all know what happened the next year. The Malice in the Palace happened after just a couple of games. Ron Artest's entire career changed and plateaued, and that team really was never the same after that. But speaking of teams in the Eastern Conference, let's talk about one that actually did make the finals, and that is the 2000s New Jersey Nets. Now, if I'm being honest, there is a reason why the Nets are kind of left out of the discussion among teams in the 2000s, or just great teams in general, and that is the fact that they were in the weak Eastern Conference. And we're not talking about your normal weak Eastern Conference of like the 2010s with LeBron going to 8 straight finals. No, we're talking about a 2000s that had teams that were getting the 1st or 2nd seed with barely 50 wins. And in some years, 50 wins would get you the 1st seed. Think about how pathetic of an Eastern Conference that was. That's why a team like the Detroit Pistons winning the championship surprised a lot of people, because people just didn't take the Eastern Conference seriously. It didn't matter if it was Allen Iverson getting to the finals, or in this case, Jason Kidd getting to the NBA Finals with guys like Kenyon Martin and Richard Jefferson. People just didn't expect them to win because the East was that trash. But I don't want to shit on them too much, because the reason I even brought them up in the first place was just to explain that they are not as bad as a lot of people make them seem. Yes, they did get swept in the finals and they lost in a 6-game series, but still, that does not mean that they were this awful team. They were consistently one of the better defensive teams in the league despite a lot of their offensive struggles. And the main 2 people leading their defensive unit was Jason Kidd, who was one of the better perimeter defenders of all time, making multiple all-defensive teams, and also Kenyon Martin in the paint, who was one of the better defensive players at his position. Then you throw in a young Richard Jefferson in the mix, who was a really solid scorer out of the gates and led on to become one of the better scorers in the league for years to come. And it's no surprise why they were able to get by despite not having a great offense consistently. And though I have ragged on Jason Kidd, I said he's just the black Ricky Rubio, but he was still a really good player back in the day who developed the jump shot eventually in his career that helped him extend his career. As I said earlier, he's one of the best guard defenders of all time, and he's one of the greatest playmakers ever as well. I mean, with his inefficiencies as a scorer, he was still able to find ways to pick apart the defense, whether in transition or in the half court, and that is due to his high basketball IQ. Now, unfortunately, this team was never really able to get over that hump of getting back to the NBA Finals after the 2003 NBA season, as teams just started getting better, such as the Pistons, and obviously guys like LeBron came and Dwayne Wade. And the Nets tried because they brought in Vince Carter, and things just never really panned out again, as poor performances from certain players in the postseason, primarily Vince Carter, led to them having premature exits in the playoffs. But speaking of things ending prematurely, that brings us to the final team that we're going to discuss, and that is the 2000s Mavericks. And I'm not talking about the late 2000s Mavericks, I'm talking about the early 2000s Dallas Mavericks with Steve Nash and Dirk Nowitzki. I believe that they are one of the more forgotten duos in NBA history. And obviously the main reason for that is because Dirk and Steve Nash had the more iconic moments of their career post playing together, as Steve Nash would win back-to-back MVPs in Phoenix along with Mike D'Antoni, and also Dirk Nowitzki would have his iconic 2011 playoff run. But don't let that distract you from the fact that the Mavericks were one of the better teams in the 2000s and one of the greatest offenses of all time. Because for people who don't know, Steve Nash was already an elite level playmaker in Dallas, making a couple of all-star teams and even an all-NBA team. The way he was able to pick apart defenses was still outstanding while also being an elite level shooter. Then you combine that with the guy like Dirk Nowitzki, who had an unstoppable jump shot, could shoot the 3 ball, an amazing mid-range game, could get to the free throw line and shoot that at around 90% as well. And it's no surprise that they had one of the greatest offenses of all time. And in the 2003 NBA season, after winning 6 60 games and being the best offense in the NBA yet again, they were able to capture the first seed and secure that home court advantage, but it didn't mean anything as they got to the conference finals and lost in 6 games due to Dirk going down in game 3 with the knee injury. And that's always one of the bigger what ifs, like what if Dirk didn't get injured? They probably would have won that series and maybe even won the championship that year, and maybe Mark Cuban could have had more common sense on his side to keep Steve Nash to pair along with Dirk Nowitzki. But we all know how the story went from there. Steve Nash eventually left in free agency because Mark Cuban gave him a smaller contract offer than the Suns gave him, and the rest was history. But you guys let me know your opinions down below in the comment section, because that concludes this video. If you disagree with any of the teams that I mentioned or you think I left any teams out, let me know down below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and press that bell for post notifications. It's your boy Young Mustard signing out. You guys stay safe and have a blessed day. Peace.